Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. This is Alex Sacken, and today we're going to be continuing our multi-part series on the secret history of the 20th century. And in particular, with this episode, we're going to be wrapping up our mini-series on World War II and how significant this period of time was to everything that came after, not only in the 20th century, but also today in the 21st century. And so the beginning of this series, this kind of mini-series on World War II, happened a couple episodes ago with the episode titled The Hidden Agenda Behind World War II. And then that was followed up by the previous episode, which I did a couple days ago, which was called The Hidden Hand and the Price of Secrecy. And in those episodes, I argued that there was a sort of long-term plan and strategy that World War II helped facilitate, which was to harvest a secret weapons program that was begun in Germany during the war and to bring that over into America. And I believe that that was the sort of hidden agenda behind World War II. And so the key to this theory was one I actually laid out 3 episodes ago, which was in an episode called The Classified Science of Nikola Tesla. And in that episode, I laid out the idea that there was, beginning around the turn of the century, around 1900, there was a whole alternate paradigm of physics that was based on the idea of the ether, that this went classified and sort of disappeared from public view. And the reason for this was because of the breakthrough technologies that could be developed using this science, that the world wasn't ready yet for these technologies to come out in the sort of chaotic geopolitical environment of the time. And so a long-term plan had to be enacted, and I think this was enacted at the level of sort of grand secret society. But a long-term plan had to be enacted to bring the world into a state of global government. But the instruments that would be used to bring about this global government were those sort of imperial oligarchs that had taken control over the main power centers of the West. And that these were the entities that actually couldn't know about this technology. So they had to be led into establishing this global government for their own reasons, but not knowing that there was a hidden agenda behind the whole program. So that's the basic theory, and I've been unfolding it gradually over the past couple episodes. And so in this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into Germany during the war and during the pre-war period, and we're going to look at the secret weapons development program that they were working on, one that is not taught in schools and it's very hard to learn about. There's, very few really good sources about it, but it's the sort of linchpin of this whole theory. And it connects with this other concept. I'm going to be touching on this again in this article, but it touches, or this whole thing is tied into this idea in the pre-war period that America, or American agents, American capitalists, various entities for their own purposes and reasons were involved in setting up the foundations of a world cartel system, particularly energy cartel. But what this means is that the core components of America's military industrial complex before the war, World War II, they were linked with those in Germany. And it was a systematic operation that was set up. So the major industrial cartels in Germany, in Nazi Germany, wouldn't have existed without they having been deliberately set up in this interwar period by a coordinated effort. And that coordinated effort couldn't have come about without the sort of planning and approval of the national security state. And so this all ties into this hypothesis that I'm laying out, because there really is no good explanation for why the system was set up, this sort of interconnected cartel system was set up in those pre-war periods, other than to just say it was corruption and collusion. But as I've argued and will continue to argue, there's clearly more going on than just, greed and corruption. So all this goes into informing the foundations of what we're going to be talking about in this episode today. So this episode, which is part 8 in this series on the secret history of the 20th century, is called The Untold Story of the Nazi Wonder Weapons. And in particular, it wasn't just the Nazis who were involved with these development of these secret quote-unquote wonder weapons, but it was actually the SS, as we'll be going into. That was the core of the Nazi party, and it was somewhat of a state within a state. So really the wonder weapons were developed by the SS, not just the Nazi party as a whole. So this is a really long article, very comprehensive, very in-depth. It might be one of the longest in this whole book project that I've been doing. which is called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And this story that I'm going into does tie into these larger themes I've been doing over the past year and a half on my channel that have to do with philosophy and going in depth, because I'm going to tie philosophy back into it at the very end of this chapter. So I have a few more articles or episodes to go until we conclude this chapter on the secret history of the 20th century. So I'm going to be going back into some philosophical ideas that connect with things I've done in the past. But for anybody who doesn't know, if you go to my website, alexsakin.com, if you hit the publications tab on that website, you can see a breakdown of the full book project with links to all the various articles. And each article has a corresponding podcast episode. So without further ado, because this is such a long article, I want to jump right into it. And I'm going to not do too much commentary because we have a lot of material to cover. So yeah, let's jump into it. This first section of this article is called The Hidden Hand Revisited. And The Hidden Hand was the title of the first section of my previous article. So we're going to go back into this idea of the hidden hand. So without further ado, let's get into the article. Once again, this first section is called The Hidden Hand Revisited, and we're going to be jumping into that right now. All right, let's get things started here. In the previous two articles of this ongoing series on the secret history of the 20th century, we discussed how, in the decades preceding the onset of World War II, the military-industrial complexes of America and Germany had been secretly linked together, with a systematic network of interlocked corporate and financial ties being quietly yet thoroughly established between them. The overarching plan behind this maneuver seems to have been to set the stage for a world cartel system, one centered around the rising global hegemony of America, the sole world power that would emerge unscathed from the carnage of World War II, with its major European rivals having become bled dry from the conflict. During our previous discussions of this plan for an American-centered world cartel system, I have tried to emphasize how it came together in such a way that different stakeholders involved in implementing this plan participated in it for different reasons. Everyone had their own motivations for building it. Very few knew or realized what the larger grand strategy behind the whole project was, or who was leading it. Recalling back to the metaphor I referenced in a previous article of the blind men and the elephant, we see that the different players who carried out this project each played their own particular part, knowing only the one piece of the elephant they were touching, never the whole. For example, the military interests involved in the plan were pursuing global hegemony for their own reasons. Likewise, the banking and corporate interests involved in the project had their own motivations for pursuing it. Meanwhile, influential dynastic families who played key roles in setting up this system, ones like the Rockefellers, held personal beliefs that motivated them to seek control over the world system for their own purposes. Each of these key players played a significant role in fulfilling the common project of building an American-centered world empire, one centered around the blending of private corporate interests with American military power. But each had their own reasons for doing so. This dynamic creates the perfect condition for an unseen orchestrator, a secret society or quote-unquote hidden hand, to operate behind the scenes, maneuvering each of these blind men into place so that each could play its proper role and part. Such a hidden hand could, from its unseen vantage point, orchestrate the whole project from above, doing so for its own mysterious reasons. I've hinted at what these might be in previous articles. The primary one likely being its desire to consolidate control over the development of world-altering breakthrough energy technologies, ones based around the alchemical concept of the luminiferous ether. In the process of implementing this grand plan of the hidden hand, each of the aforementioned chess pieces would be delegated its own specific role and task necessary to the fulfillment of the overall project, though they wouldn't know this is what was happening. Meanwhile, the hidden hand could remain entirely invisible and secret, with none save a small number of initiates knowing the full extent of its existence or true intentions. This is important to emphasize because I believe that the story of the Nazis, the SS, and the entire Second World War cannot be understood without reference to this idea. In particular, I think we need this theory to adequately explain the mysterious black projects that the SS was running in vast underground facilities, both in terms of how these projects first arose and what happened to them after the war. In my view, there's no real way to explain the rise of the Nazis, or more specifically the SS, the inner elite of the Nazi Party, unless one comes to view them as players playing their part on a grand geopolitical chessboard. In other words, the Germans were an instrument utilized by a mysterious hidden hand operating secretly within America, only they didn't know it, believing instead that they were pioneers acting totally on their own. The SS elite truly believed they were on the cusp of making unique and totally original scientific and technological breakthroughs, ones that had never before been achieved, and could be leveraged by them to victory in the war and the establishment of a global Reich. But in truth, the Nazi SS were never acting entirely alone, and the strange paradigms of science and technology research they were moving into were ones that had previously been explored almost a full century prior within the remote expanses of the American West. In order to understand just how not alone the Nazi SS actually were, we have to recall the fact that at every step of the way, its leadership was dependent upon the resources and supplies provided by the massive industrial cartels that ran the country's military-industrial complex. Clearly, any top-secret weapons development project that Nazi SS research scientists pursued would have had to be done in partnership with the large industrial cartels that dominated the German landscape, notably IG Farben and AEG, or German General Electric, these being two of the most notable. As we've been exploring in this ongoing series on the secret history of the 20th century, both of these entities, German industry and banking, had for more than a decade prior to the war been systematically infiltrated by American corporate interests, ones possessing deep ties to the US national security state. In fact, Germany's powerful industrial cartels, and in turn the Nazi Wehrmacht that relied upon them, would not have existed at all without they having first been engineered into existence by American banking, industrial, and military intelligence agents during the pre-war period. For example, the Nazi Wehrmacht couldn't have functioned at all without the assistance of American deep state affiliated corporations like Standard Oil, which supplied the German cartel IG Farben with technological know-how for generating synthetic gasoline and rubber, two elements without which the Nazi war campaign could never have taken place. After the war, the Rockefellers and other participants in this system, such as Ford, ITT, and General Electric, were not only not punished for their treason, but actually were rewarded, with their power and influence within the American deep state only increasing. Clearly, this collusion had been systematically set up. The US national security state wanted it to happen. And why would they want it to happen? Well, there may have been different overlapping reasons, but one of the primary ones is that these corporate ties served as a mechanism through which the US military intelligence apparatus could infuse itself into the German military-industrial complex. Then, once this infiltration had taken place, US intelligence would have been able to gain intel about the inner workings of the Nazi war machine, including what types of secret weapons technologies its scientists were working on. Through this mechanism, a hidden hand may have even been able to secretly guide the direction of these research projects, ensuring that things developed along a certain pathway, one that served the long-term interests of a secret grand strategy known fully only by a small number of initiates. In sum, the Nazi war machine was a creation of the American national security state, and throughout the war, America maintained key strategic assets within Germany, most notably within its central bank, the Reichsbank, which it had helped to set up in the 1920s, and in vital war-making industrial cartels like AEG and IG Farben, both of which it had also set up during the 1920s. These points are important to keep in mind because, as we delve deeper into the story of the Nazis' secret weapon research programs, there is reason to believe that a hidden hand in America may have been able to gain access to intel about their progress and breakthroughs. Perhaps they may have even been able to steer the trajectory of its development from behind the scenes. This is not to say that I think the entire American military leadership was aware of this top secret project. Actually, I think it is a necessary aspect of the story that it was not. Rather, I believe that the mysterious entity I've been terming the quote-unquote hidden hand was behind the whole scheme, it existing something like a secret society, one with an expertise in the ether-based paradigm of scientific research and technology development that the Nazi SS were moving into. The headquarters of this secret society was in America, and its branches extended into all elements of the US military-industrial complex, its initiates and disciples having penetrated into it from the very beginning of its establishment. It is also indicated that this secret society had branches extended throughout the world, something like how the Masonic and Rosicrucian networks once promulgated during the 17th and 18th centuries, when they helped coordinate the rise of global revolutions throughout the world. Actually, I believe this hidden hand is directly related to these historical secret societies, but the full explanation of that will have to wait for another article. So that's what I'm going to be getting into at the very end of this chapter. But for now, that finishes this first section. So once again, that was called The Hidden Hand Revisited. And there I'm just kind of recapping the theory I've been laying out over the past couple articles. So now we're going to be moving into the main body of this current article, which is on the story of the Nazi SS and their secret weapons programs, but also their ideologies. So this next section is called The Homegrown Occult Ideology of the Nazi SS. All right, the homegrown occult ideology of the Nazi SS. With this introduction now under our belts, let's begin an exploration into the story of the Nazi SS and the secret empire of unorthodox weapons development projects they were operating during the latter phases of the war. This story begins, as you might now expect, in the crucial interwar decades of the 1920s and 30s, the time period when the German military-industrial complex was first set up through the coordinated effort of American intelligence agents, defense contractors, and technocratic central bankers. Meanwhile, during the same period in Germany, a homegrown occult ideology was also rising. This would influence the formation of the Nazi SS, the elite state within a state entity that would, over the course of the war, seize power from the outer branches of the Nazi Party. Joseph P. Farrell, in a series of books such as Reich of the Black Sun, The Nazi International, and SS Brotherhood of the Bell, has meticulously laid out the story of the rise of the Nazi SS. Other researchers have also done important work in this field, such as Nick Cook, Peter Levenda, and Nicholas Goodrich Clark. The key element of interest in this story is how the strange occult beliefs held by the SS inspired them to take a very unusual approach to the areas of weapons development research. Farrell begins his analysis of the SS by noting that during the 1920s and early 1930s, prior to the Nazi assumption of power, Germany was a veritable cauldron of alchemical ferment and other occult and esoteric activity. As the Nazis came to power, these esoteric ideas came to influence and color the formation of their ideological worldview. This ideological worldview would in turn shape not only the formation of their grand strategy for establishing a global Reich, but would also influence how they approached the topic of weapons development research. Before going deeper into the story, I want to first emphasize that just because a society forms around an interest in occult knowledge does not mean that they automatically understand what it is they are grappling with or become advanced in their knowledge about the field. In Germany in particular, many pseudo-Masonic and other types of occult societies existed, with the lineage of these movements dating back hundreds of years. Within this milieu, different societies rose advocating different belief systems, each coming to different conclusions about the topic of esoteric philosophy. There was a lot of confusion and misinformation spreading about, and no one was reaching enlightenment, though many undoubtedly tried. Esoteric philosophy is one of the most confusing and challenging fields you can possibly study. Therefore, one should expect that dabblers in this field will almost surely project and intermingle their own ideas and beliefs into the systems of symbolism that they are studying. A situation that will inevitably result in a false and biased interpretation of what the doctrine actually teaches. Likewise, in terms of one's ability to demonstrate certain occult powers like clairvoyance or psychotelepathy, just because a savant may emerge with certain psychic powers developed, such as that found with a psychic or a clairvoyant, this doesn't mean that these persons are automatically masters in the esoteric doctrine that explains their power. Nor does it mean that what they are channeling or experiencing is free from the coloring and biases of their own psychological apparatus. Keep these points in mind as we proceed. Just because the Nazis were interested in occult philosophy and experimenting with scientific research based on its ideas doesn't mean that they actually understood what they were doing or the larger cosmic forces they were messing with. There is an important implication to this, one easily overlooked. The Nazis, and as we will see the SS in particular, were basically starting from scratch in the formulation of their occult doctrines. This means they didn't have access to and thus weren't able to incorporate the priceless heritage of wisdom teachings traditionally maintained within the mystery schools. This is important to note because it implies that whatever occult ideas the Nazis were discovering and working with, they were never alone in terms of their interest in these subjects. Alongside them, but likely unbeknownst to them, there also existed other secret societies who did have access to the older lineage of ancient wisdom teachings, and thus had a much more advanced understanding of the realms of knowledge that the Nazis were trying to gain access to. By implication, for every technological breakthrough the SS was pursuing using ancient occult ideas, there was almost certainly existing alongside it a much more advanced research program taking place somewhere else. One that was far superior, given that it would be run by a secret society possessing a much more advanced understanding of ancient occult knowledge. Such a society would thus have been in the position to know ahead of time what the pathway of discovery would look like for the Nazis to achieve any truly significant breakthroughs in their research into this field. Having this knowledge ahead of time, such a society would then be in a position to perhaps misdirect and retard the Nazis' research efforts, making sure that they didn't make too rapid a progress in their research work. Keep this in mind as we proceed. Continuing now with our narrative, Farrell points out that it was not the Nazi Party as a whole that became heavily indoctrinated with occult ideas, but rather its innermost elite structure, the SS. Farrell emphasizes that when it came to the power structure within Nazi Germany, one must differentiate between the outer Nazi Party and the inner elite within the SS. He writes that, quote, "It is less accurate to speak of an occult influence on the entire Nazi state, as it is to speak of an esoteric influence at the uppermost levels of the command structure of the SS. One is, so to speak, dealing with a Black Reich within the Reich, and at the uppermost reaches of the SS, with a very secret, esoteric, and specifically alchemical belief system." This truth is reflected in the meaning of the SS aphorism itself. Outwardly, the SS aphorism is said to stand for the word Schutzstaffel, which translates to mean something like protection squad or elite guard. Inwardly, however, the aphorism took on another meaning, Schwarze Sonne, or black sun, which is an esoteric concept that the SS had repurposed from their studies into the occult. Farrell explains how the background ideology that informed the SS worldview, particularly as it pertains to the topic of race, was influenced by the SS's own customary interpretation of various occult doctrines, including Helena Blavatsky's theosophical teachings, which were blended together with certain heterodox Christian ideas and native Germanic and Scandinavian pagan belief systems. What resulted was a mix and match creation that was entirely unphilosophical, one that arbitrarily picked and chose between the conflicting teachings of various occult doctrines, selecting from among them whatever ideas and beliefs suited the deep-rooted subconscious prejudices and fixations of the German people. This patchwork of occult ideas was then woven together to form a new, custom mythological system. One early influential figure involved in the formation of this custom ideology was a man by the name of Lanz von Liebenfels. As Farrell describes him, he was a former Roman Catholic monk who had, through his knowledge of early Christian patristic literature, reconstructed what he believed to have been the actual early text of the Old Testament. As Farrell further describes, von Liebenfels' reconstructed New Testament became a component of a larger program of historical revisionism, one based in part on the theosophical teachings of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, in which various root races gradually declined from a golden age past to mankind's current decadent condition. In von Liebenfels' hands, this decline was due to the racial corruption of the quote-unquote pure Aryan lineage of a white Teutonic race. The source of this corruption was the, quote, intermingling of the cultures and blood of inferior races, such as, predictably enough, the Jews. These unphilosophical ideas became incorporated into and further developed by an influential Austrian secret society called the Tula Gesellschaft, or Tula Society, founded by a man named Rudolf von Sabbatendorf. This occult society is notable to our story because it featured within its ranks several individuals who would in time rise to become prominent members of the Nazi SS. Farrell emphasizes that the SS itself became the visible extension of the Tula Gesellschaft into the Third Reich. Or to put it differently, via the National Socialist Party, an occult secret society had seized the reins of authority in one of the world's great powers, and could thus direct the entire energies of that state into the pursuit of its agendas. Elaborating on the strange beliefs of this society, he writes that, quote, among the doctrines held by the Tula Gesellschaft was an Aryo-Germanic reconstruction of religion, one set forth by the philosopher Guido von List. His teachings leaned toward the anti-Old Testament views of an early Christian heresy known as Marcionism. These views were further augmented within the Tula Gesellschaft by a reconstructed occult history of the Aryan race, a history reconstructed from ancient Germanic and Scandinavian myths. Chief among these was a belief in Hyperborea, the continent populated by the ancient Aryans, as they believed, with its capital city of Ultima Thule, both of which were located in the highest north. Moreover, these ancient Aryans were conceived as space travelers from a planet in the star system Aldebaran, the main star in the constellation of Taurus. So I just want to point out, like, some of these key words like Hyperborea, Aryan, that these are legitimate concepts that you do find in esoteric philosophy, but the members of the secret society, the Tula Gesellschaft, have completely misconstrued them and colored them with a sort of materialistic, concept. So it was those kinds of misinterpretations where you take a seed of something that is true or correct teachings, but you color it with your own biases and perspectives. And I'll be touching a little bit about how they did the same thing with this term Aryan and the idea of the Aryan root race, is that they've completely misconstrued what it means. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because I've talked about it so much in previous episodes. But it is one of the foundational concepts that I work with throughout this whole book project. But the way I talk about it and the way I interpret it has nothing to do with the Nazi form of interpretation. So let me just read the part that I have a note about this. So I write, note, the concept of the Aryan root race is a foundational component of esoteric philosophy. But the true wisdom teachings regarding this concept have nothing to do with how the Nazis came to interpret it. We should therefore abandon the Nazi conception of the term and return it to its original philosophical form of interpretation. In this way, we can restore the word its proper dignity while revealing key elements of the mystery of human evolution in the process. For more, see my previous articles on the topic. I also touch on this in my 2021 Atlantis publication, which you can find in my Big Cartel store, which I have a link on my website to. So within the ideological environment fostered by the Tula Society, one individual in particular would rise to play a significantly influential role in the development of subsequent events, specifically those pertaining to the rise of the Nazi SS. This individual was a man named Karl Maria Wiligut. Wiligut became a key influencer and advisor to Heinrich Himmler, the mastermind of the SS, and the lead orchestrator of its rise to power within the Nazi Party. Under Himmler's direction, the SS gradually took control of the task of formulating and implementing the long-range vision and strategy for Nazi Germany. Over the course of the war, it would also take control over Germany's secret weapons development projects. In short, Himmler's SS would become Nazi Germany's version of the deep state, meaning a hidden shadow government. In the course of Himmler's rise to power, Karl Maria Wiligut would become an important and influential trusted advisor to him, even becoming known as Himmler's Rasputin. For this reason, it is important to analyze what it exactly was that Wiligut believed, as this will tell us much about what the SS's mind state and long-term goals were. Forel explains that, in his initial rise to prominence within the Tula Society, Wiligut quickly became involved in the post-World War I right-wing politics of Austria and Germany, editing an influential journal that had as its goal to expose, quote, the conspiracies of the Jews, Freemasons, and Roman Catholics, especially the Jesuits. And I just want to note, when the Nazis rose to power, those secret societies, and particularly Freemasons, were sort of abolished. So I just want to point that out. After meeting Himmler at a conference, the two struck up a quick friendship, with Wiligut soon being selected to come work for Himmler directly. In short time, Himmler appointed him as the head of the SS department for pre- and early history. In this capacity, Wiligut would become Himmler's main advisor on ancient occult traditions. Forel informs us that, quote, so important and influential was Wiligut during this period that he was instrumental in the selection and design of Himmler's infamous SS order castle at Wewelsburg, the secretive Austrian headquarters of the SS elite. He was also influential in specifying the design of the ring worn by the SS elite and in the formulation of secret SS rituals performed in their order castle. In large part due to Willigut's influence, in 1935, Himmler founded an internal department or think tank within the SS called the Ahnenerbe Dienst, which translates to Cultural Heritage Service. Its primary objectives included the scientific and archaeological study of esoteric and ancient lore, legends, and myths. One of the underlying goals of this effort was to specify any military potential these unorthodox streams of knowledge may have held. Forel emphasizes just how significant the Ahnenerbe became in the long-term plans of the SS, and in particular to the occult-oriented approach to weapons development that it would later pursue. He writes that, quote, in a certain sense, Himmler had willed into existence an entire government bureaucracy to do nothing but military studies of the esoteric, all under his personal control. This created an unusual, if not unique, first in modern history, because for the first time, a technologically and scientifically sophisticated great power was acknowledging, even if covertly, the existence of a very ancient high civilization whose science it was intent upon recovering. In his writings, Farrell cites one member of this think tank, an astrologer named Wilhelm Wolff, who had been made a prisoner of the SS and was coerced into working for the Ahnenerbe. Wolff described the operational parameters of the Ahnenerbe as follows. Its mandate was to, quote, harness not only natural, but also supernatural forces. All intellectual, natural, and supernatural sources of power, from modern technology to medieval black magic, and from the teachings of Pythagoras to the Faustian pentagram incantation, were to be exploited in the interests of final victory. Certainly, in the original formulation of this SS research organization into the occult, Carl Maria Willigut's influence on Himmler would have played a significant role. Farrell explores this point further, writing that Wiligut not only, quote, played an important role in conceptualizing and designing certain esoteric aims and practices of Himmler's elite circle within the SS, but likely also played an influencing factor on Himmler's decision to create the Ahnenerbe. For his own personal esoteric views were certainly in line with those held and developed by the SS Ahnenerbe leaders themselves. So basically, we're talking about this SS state within a state structure within Nazi Germany. This was basically like the modern version of black magicians, that they're looking to leverage the laws of nature for anti-social and destructive purposes. It's sort of like exactly the paradigm or the archetype of old Atlantis repeated. With the Atlantean like priest magicians, using their God-given abilities to try to enslave the various colonies that they held. And this is something I've talked about in previous chapters. So it's like there's very strongly an Atlantean archetype playing out here, in my opinion. The idea that the SS, which operated as a secret and confined state within a state within the Nazi Party, was interested in utilizing occult knowledge in order to develop breakthrough, potentially war-winning technologies, opens the door to our next topic of analysis, the Kammlerstab, another specialized think tank within the SS, one tasked with the actual scientific engineering of technologies inspired by the occult concepts being researched by the Ahnenerbe scholars. This top-secret scientific R&D unit, the Kammlerstab, was overseen by a man named Hans Kammler. Its mission was to take the occult ideas initially pursued by the Ahnenerbe, such as alchemy, and convert them into actionable hard science physics equations and engineering concepts. Ones that could be used to develop new breakthrough weapons technologies, ones that could turn the tide of the war. Because of the unique and vital role it played in carrying out the long-range vision of Himmler's SS, the Kammlerstab emerges as a central element in our story. It is the entity responsible for developing the infamous and mysterious wonder weapons of the Nazis. And for this reason, in the next section, we will turn our attention to undertaking a deep and comprehensive investigation of it. So that's the end of that section. And once again, that was called the homegrown occult ideology of the Nazi SS. And once again, I just want to emphasize basically what we're looking at here with the SS and now with the Kammlerstab is literally the remanifestation of an old archetype of the black magician, the evil, or actually, as I've been terming it in my previous series on America, this is Tezcatlipoca. So, something archetypal is happening here. Okay, let's move on. The next section is called Hans Kammler's Secret Empire. And so we'll be going more into this Kammlerstab entity. All right, so Hans Kammler's Secret Empire, let's get into it. As we discussed above, through the influence of organizations like the Thule Gesellschaft and individuals like Carl Maria Wiligut and SS chief Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi government, from the point of its first origin, began incorporating various streams of occult knowledge into the development of its worldview. This included not only its ideology, but also its approach to scientific research and weapons design. Over the course of the war, this influx of occult knowledge into the Nazi state became utilized by the SS, the elite stratum of the Nazi Party, in order to develop breakthrough weapons technologies of all different varieties. As Heinrich Himmler himself once wrote, his explicit purpose for researching ancient occult knowledge was to incorporate it into, quote, an institute for military scientific research. And this he was successful, and the Kammlerstab was the end product that resulted from this effort. The mastermind that Himmler tasked with spearheading his unorthodox secret weapons development program was a talented engineer named Hans Kammler. After beginning his career in a rather unassuming role within the Nazi engineering department, Kammler, relatively early on in the war, was transferred into the Nazis' elite SS division, where he rose quickly in the ranks. In fact, his rise to prominence within the SS was so rapid that researcher Nick Cook described it as being meteoric. In short time, Kammler, a very eager and ambitious career opportunist, was named head of the SS's Building and Works Department. In this role, he oversaw the design and build-out of the highly classified facilities used by the SS in their top-secret R&D programs for occult-inspired weapons technologies. In his role as lead engineer of the Buildings and Works Department, Kammler was also put in charge of yet another key SS task, overseeing the design and build-out of the Nazis' vast network of concentration camps, which during the war had as many as 14 million people moving through it. What is generally not emphasized in the official public version of World War II history is that there was a close alignment between the location of these concentration camps and the sites of the SS's highly secretive weapons production programs. The reason for this alignment is that the concentration camps were used as a supply of replenishable and disposable slave labor for these top secret facilities. Initially, these slaves would be used for the build-out of these facilities, many of which were located underground. Then, after the building phase was completed, these slaves were utilized to man the weapons production operations that were contained within these facilities. The plan for this was originally developed by Himmler and his economic advisor Oswald Pohl. As Nick Cook explains, for a year, Reichsfuhrer SS Himmler had harbored a grand scheme to turn the SS into a self-sustaining economic entity, one capable of funding and running its affairs without reliance on the everyday financial and administrative mechanisms that maintained and sustained the Reich. It was via the camps that Himmler and his leading economic authority, Oswald Pohl, realized that they could achieve their aims. Kammler was the man tasked with making this vision a reality, and it was a role he would lean into and embrace with maniacal zeal. As Cook further explains, quote, the sense that the SS gave Kammler free rein to indulge his ideas and ambitions, suppressed during his years of obscure service at the RLM, which was his previous posting within the Nazi state, is unavoidable. No sooner had his appointment into the SS taken effect than he was drawing up detailed plans for the rapid expansion of the camps, egged on by Pohl, who had impressed upon him their value as the engines of growth for his and Himmler's grotesque vision. As head of the SS Buildings and Works Department, Kammler was put in charge of the vital task of integrating the intertwined programs of concentration camps and secret R&D facilities. The latter used the former as a source of cheap and disposable labor and couldn't exist without them. For this reason, Kammler became an indispensable asset of the SS and its vision for how to win the war and establish a global Reich. Many of the secret technological facilities Kammler was charged with designing were ones hidden away in elaborate underground bases, ones that slave labor in the concentration camps were tasked with building out, usually in brutal and unforgiving conditions. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of inmates died in the effort of constructing these facilities. As the war progressed, Kammler became increasingly tasked with overseeing not only the construction projects for the weapons facilities, but also the weapons programs themselves. In this way, he rose to become basically a singular mastermind in charge of every key element of the SS's top secret weapons technology program. In this capacity, he was, by war's end, the most important asset within the Nazi war campaign, perhaps second only to Himmler himself. As the war moved into its later stages, when it became clear that the Nazis weren't going to win the war through traditional military means, Kammler's secret think tank became seen as its sole hope for victory. In this way, the future hopes of the SS were placed almost entirely in the hands of Hans Kammler. It is not an exaggeration to say that the fate of the world rested in Kammler's capacity to execute on the development of the potentially war-winning weapons technologies that his think tank was working on, ones that included not only well-known weapons like the famous V-2 rockets and the various advanced fighter jets they were tinkering with, but also the production of functional nuclear weapons. These the Kammlerstab had successfully developed as early as 1944, apparently undergoing 2 or more successful tests of them, but for a complex number of reasons they didn't have a chance to use them against the Allies during the war. And in the article, I share 2 links. One is to a book of Dr. Farrell's that goes deep into this issue of the successful Nazi nuclear program. one that you don't hear about, but apparently it was successful. They did test weapons before the Americans even. And as I'll be discussing, it seems like the Americans only developed a successful weapon after certain defectors from this German program sort of traded their tech to America, their enriched uranium. And so there's an interesting story around that. And so you can go into this book of Dr. Farrell's, which I have linked in the article. And then there's another actually documentary that came out in the past couple of years by a German production company that's quite good. There's two of them. There's one on Hans Kammler and one on this secret German nuclear weapons program. And these are very new documentaries, like they're kind of state of the art. And they also reference the fact that it seems that the Nazis developed a successful nuclear program. But they don't go into as much detail into some of the more sort of esoteric aspects that Dr. Farrell does. So I have links to both of those. But let's continue. In order to advance the development of these weapon technology programs at breakneck speed, the slaves imprisoned in the concentration camps were ruthlessly and brutally worked to death. An element of extreme desperation was at work. The SS was frantically working to bring its weapons technologies to a state where they could be mass manufactured and used against the Allied powers to win the war. By war's end, they saw this as their only hope of victory, and the immense supply of disposable concentration camp laborers connected to their R&D facilities made this whole operation possible. In almost every way, the advanced weapons technologies that the Kammlerstab developed and were prototyping by war's end were years, if not decades, ahead of what the American military possessed. At least the overt American military. When the American military finally made it to the secret weapons laboratories of the Nazi scientists, many of which were hidden away underground, they were shocked, amazed, and horrified at what they discovered and how far in advance the Nazis were in their weapons development programs. And it was Kammler who was the central figure in charge of this whole operation. As a side note, Farrell and others have speculated that America's Manhattan Project was only able to complete its production of functional atomic weapons, which it would infamously use against Japan, after being traded sufficient supplies of enriched uranium to complete them by key SS defectors, possibly including Hitler's right-hand man, Martin Bormann, in exchange for safe passage down to Argentina. Apparently, the Americans weren't able to complete these bombs on their own, and only achieved success after receiving technical aid from more advanced SS scientists defecting from Nazi Germany. Returning back to the subject of Kammler's secret weapons think tank, researchers Joseph Farrell, Nick Cook, and Igor Witkowski have each written books dedicated to outlining the hidden structure of Kammler's secret weapons empire in detail. Through their efforts, we discover that Hans Kammler's deeply classified think tank, called the Kammlerstab, was headquartered in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, concealed within the engineering division of the Skoda munitions works. From this base, its operations branched out into secret locations located within various Nazi-held territories, though its primary locations of activity were concentrated in Nazi-held Czechoslovakia and the regions surrounding Pilsen. Hidden away within its headquarters in the Skoda works, Kammler's think tank was tasked with the mission of thinking outside the box of the conventional scientific orthodoxies of the time. Furthermore, as Farrell explains, its scientists were expected to develop the basic outlines of technology trees that would lead to second, third, and even fourth generation weapons of all sorts, and to lay the groundwork of what was needed to achieve them. For them, this effectively meant that its scientists were expected to work on researching and developing new paradigms of physics, once different from the conventional relativistic models used in the West. The SS viewed these as Jewish physics, quote unquote, and abandoned them. As a replacement, Kammlerstab scientists instead looked to ground their approach on a different foundation, one influenced by the occult research being constructed by the Ahnenerbe, the antiques research unit discussed previously. As it turns out, the Kammlerstab's approach was highly effective. What resulted was the invention and development of new weapons types of every conceivable variety, including nuclear weapons, and those far more destructive, as we'll see. Pondering the significance of what was taking place in the shadows of Nazi Germany, Farrell writes, quote, "Something else altogether occurred in Nazi Germany. Some other paradigm was adopted early on and pursued with all the economic and scientific resources and intellectual brilliance that a modern, technologically sophisticated great power could muster. A whole new paradigm of physics, a combination of vortex ether, quantum electrodynamics, and nuclear physics, appeared to not only have been outlined, but conceptually and experimentally developed." Farrell continues, writing that within Kammler's top secret think tank, An ideological culture of scientific research and development was established that was vastly different from that of the surrounding civilization. A culture in which science itself was drafted to serve a political agenda of empire building and hegemony via technological means. Exploring further the operational structure of Kammler's think tank, Farrell notes that the choice to embed this organization inside of Bohemia, Czechoslovakia was entirely logical, for Bohemia had been made a Reich protectorate and fell under the immediate jurisdiction of the SS. The SS had, in effect, turned all of Bohemia into a military reservation, which to enter or leave required proper SS authorization and clearances. Within this secure zone, with its Gestapo agents crawling the countryside, ferreting out sedition, Kammler's think tank was surrounded with a triple belt of security of political, economic, and technological counterintelligence. In essence, the whole country was turned into the Nazi equivalent of the Nevada test ranges. And within this already cloistered country, Kammler had turned the engineering division of the Skoda Works into the nerve center of a vast secret weapons empire, a veritable rat's run of underground laboratories and production facilities. Indeed, it wouldn't be until decades after the war that publicly available information about this top secret think tank would come out at all. Most information about it is still classified and blocked off by US intelligence to this day. And for good reason. The US deep state secretly harvested many of its scientists after the war through operations like Operation Paperclip. This most likely includes Kammler himself, who disappeared completely after the war, his whereabouts unknown. Before moving on, let's first consider an important point, one concerning the Kammlerstab's alleged successful development of an atomic weapons program. As we covered above, SS scientists rejected the overt, artificially constructed system of physics that the outer branches of America's military-industrial complex were using. This is what led them to advance so rapidly on the science and technology fronts. They could blow past the false obstacles and hurdles that confronted Western scientists, who were handicapped by the misguided notions of relativity theory and quantum mechanics that Western academic institutions had become brainwashed with. As we also noted, one of the major weapons projects the Kammlerstab think tank had successfully developed involved atomic weapons, which they had apparently successfully tested at least once in 1944 ahead of the Americans. The challenge for them was to develop a transmission device capable of getting it to America and other key Allied targets. This was one of the highest priority secret projects the SS were working on by the end of the war. Now let's bring these two facts together so that an important truth can be revealed. As the story goes, in America's Manhattan Project, nuclear weapons were also being pursued, with successful prototypes eventually developed and used. Meanwhile, in Nazi Germany, SS scientists had abandoned the West's favored relativistic and quantum mechanics models, and yet they apparently also successfully developed a nuclear weapons program. How is this possible? How does the same weapons technology get developed using two conflicting approaches to physics? Clearly, something doesn't add up. In a previous article in this chapter, I hinted at the idea that atomic weapons don't work the way we're told they work, because the way we're told they work is based on a model of physics that is grounded in relativity theory and quantum mechanics, two approaches that have no foundation in reality and only exist as a mask for an alternative paradigm of physics that has gone classified. This alternative paradigm being that which concerns the concept of the luminiferous ether. The Kammlerstab, being outside of the West's orbit of influence, had abandoned its public science of relativity theory and quantum mechanics and instead began incorporating the ether paradigm back into its physics models. This doesn't mean that they had mastered it, but certainly they were using it as an inspiration to develop their own weapons systems. Using this alternative physics paradigm as their inspiration, Kammler's group was able to successfully develop an atomic weapon. This indicates clearly that the official story of how we are told atomic bombs work is not correct. As I speculated previously, it is likely that famous Manhattan Project scientists like Oppenheimer and von Neumann didn't understand the nature of the science underlying the weapons development program they were apparently spearheading. And as I mentioned above, it also appears that the American program was only able to finally produce a working bomb after receiving aid from Nazi defectors. For this reason, to me the Manhattan Project comes across as an elaborate psyop, the parameters of which only become clear once we factor in the hidden history of the Second World War. So that's the end of that section. And that was, once again, called Hans Kammler's Secret Empire. And we're going to be further developing our analysis of this important institution as we go forward. And we'll be discussing it some in this next section here, which is called The Occult Meaning of the Swastika. That's next. Okay, the occult meaning of the swastika. And I just want to remind everybody, in the written version of the article, each of these sections have their own visual attached to it, and some of these are really helpful to get a better grasp on the content that I'm going over. All right, let's get into it. Continuing now with our narrative of the Kammlerstab and its top secret weapons R&D program, we note that its embrace of unorthodox physics concepts, inspired by the SS's research into the occult, is the key factor that enabled its scientists to achieve breakthroughs in the realm of weapons technology development, ones that far surpass that which the overt branches of the American military-industrial complex had achieved back home. The occult influences acting upon the SS hierarchy, which in turn influenced the Kammlerstab's secret weapons technology development program, are revealed in the Nazi swastika symbol itself, a symbol whose selection was undoubtedly influenced by the early occult beliefs of the Tula Society and of individuals like Karl Maria Wiligut, who brought its ideas into the SS. As we've tracked, the so-called Aryan physics paradigm being developed by the SS was grounded in its research into the alchemical concept of the luminiferous ether. Likely, this concept made its way into the SS's orbit of awareness via its secret occult research unit, the Ahnenerbe. But, as Joseph Farrell speculates, it may have reached the SS leadership at an earlier point, coming into it through Wiligut and the Tula Society. He writes that the SS's rejection of relativity meant, to a certain extent, that the pre-relativistic idea of a luminiferous ether would have gained some currency. Indeed, with various Germanic esoteric and occult doctrines percolating in the background, such as the notion of vril energy and Reichenbach's early and well-known experiments in the 18th century on life force energy, the Germans would have been positively encouraged by the underlying ideology to undertake experimental examination of the ether's properties as far as existing technology would allow. And remember, these are the ideas that in the West had become locked down and gone classified. So Germany at this period was somewhat liberated, being outside of the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American orbit, that they were somewhat liberated to continue their experiments and pursue these ideas, whereas in the West, it seems like the lockdown was already well established. So the SS embrace of the swastika symbol is proof of their interest in the concept. Here we discover that, in its inner alchemical meaning, the swastika represents the circular, twisting, turning motion of the ether, a process that results either in the formation or dissolution of material forms, depending on which direction, clockwise or counterclockwise, the motion of the swastika is moving in. In his early writings, key SS influencer Karl Maria Wiligut makes the connection between the swastika and the idea of a transmutative ether clear, writing that when the swastika is positioned to indicate a clockwise spinning motion, moving from the left, turning to the right, the symbol represents etheric energy absorbing inward, as he terms it. Conversely, when positioned in the opposite direction, the swastika represents etheric energy radiating outward. When you combine the two spin rotations, overlapping them, you get the basis for the creation of a special type of electromagnetic field, one that allows for highly unorthodox physical phenomena to take place, including anti-gravity flight and over-unity energy generation. And as a side note, I write, the swastika, like the term Aryan, is an archetypal symbol that can be found in nearly all ancient cultures, meaning the Nazis do not own possession of it. And then I also note that a chart of several ancient cultures' use of the symbol is featured above, so that's in one of the visuals incorporated into the written article. These ideas concerning the occult significance of the swastika are critical for understanding the nature of the classified science being operationalized within the Kammlerstab's most highly classified research programs. In particular, it seems to be at the core of its most classified project of all, a program that was called the Bell, or the Glocke. In this project, SS scientists were applying in a very literal way the rotating electromagnetic fields concepts referenced above, converting them into a technology that demonstrated a number of anomalous physical characteristics, including anti-gravity levitation. The story of the Bell technology was originally unearthed by Polish researcher Igor Witkowski and further developed by British journalist Nick Cook. But it is from Joseph Farrell that I myself first learned of this most classified of Nazi research programs. Farrell introduces the topic by writing, quote, "One of the most strange objects the Germans were experimenting on was a device that was known simply as the Bell. So sensitive and secret was this device that when it was evacuated from its underground secret laboratory in Lower Silesia prior to the Russian occupation of the area, the SS shot the approximately 60 scientists, doubtless on Kammler's orders, that were involved with this strange object. These extreme measures being carried out as precautions in order to ensure absolute secrecy was preserved. Regarding the Bell experiments themselves, Nick Cook tells us that the experiments required large doses of electricity fed via thick cabling into a chamber hundreds of meters below ground. In this chamber, a bell-shaped device comprising two contra-rotating cylinders filled with mercury, or something like it, was pumped full of this energy, which stimulated it to emit a strange pale blue light. Farrell elaborates further, writing that the bell consisted apparently of two counter-rotating cylinders and resembled a bell in its general shape. It stood approximately 12 to 15 feet high and was approximately 9 to 12 feet in diameter. Into this device, an unknown purplish metallic liquid-looking substance known only as Zerum 525 was poured, apparently to be mechanically rotated at high speed, and possibly electrically rotated as well by the device. Apparently, when the device was turned on, anti-gravity effects were demonstrated. Other effects were also observed. For example, organic objects placed within the field of the bell swiftly decayed without putrefaction, decomposing into a black goo, and then finally into dust within a matter of hours. So strong was the field that resulted from the bell that on its first test, the technicians and scientists involved were all killed. In total, to quote Farrell again, the bell appears to have represented a physics, a technology, a propulsion, and a weaponry so advanced and so potentially destructive that its conceptual basis remains hidden to this day, cloaked behind the public consumption physics of relativity and an equally if not more severely flawed 19th century electrodynamics. The potentially world-altering nature of this project is hinted at by an account discovered in the diaries of the sister-in-law of Reich propaganda minister Dr. Joseph Goebbels, his wife, Magda. In winter 1944, she wrote that, the sister-in-law meaning, she wrote that Magda had confided to her that her husband had seen a secret weapon so visionary that Germany's victory in the war was all but ensured. The project's significance is also indicated by the extreme efforts that the SS took to protect and conceal it. This top-secret project was the most classified, off-the-books project that the Kammlerstab was working on, more top secret than its atomic weapons program even. Indeed, they even termed it their wonder weapon. It therefore appears to have been the keystone of the SS's entire secret weapons empire. So what was it that the SS was attempting to discover with the bell? Author Nick Cook speculates that it might have something to do with a time machine, as one of the code names the SS gave this project was Kronos. I don't agree with this assessment, however. Based on my understanding of esoteric philosophy, I don't believe that a time machine is possible, so I personally eliminate that from consideration. In my view, the bell represents two intertwined projects, both having to do with their attempt to explore and weaponize the inner mysteries of the ether. One of these has to do with the development of anti-gravity technology. The other having to do with the SS's attempt at rediscovering certain key phenomena related to the ancient esoteric science of alchemy. A few factors have led me to this conclusion. First, regarding the idea that the bell was involved with the SS's research into anti-gravity technology, there are numerous reports in the field of bell research that the device levitated. The giant concrete rig located outside of its underground testing lab also suggests this, as it appears that the device was chained up to it during levitation experiments. Second, regarding the idea that the bell represented research into the fundamentals of alchemy, we note that alchemy is at root about learning to harness and control how etheric energy moves into matter to create material forms. The dissolution of the organic objects around the bell indicates that this is what was being experimented with. The natural end goal of this process is to be able to not only dissolve material creations, but also to fashion them at will, a truly godlike power should man be able to harness it. Two other pieces of evidence support this alchemical explanation for the project. For one, in alchemy, the use of mercury has always been emphasized. Therefore, the bell's use of a mercury-based serum in its design indicates that this was what the research team was up to. The other important bit of evidence supporting this conclusion comes from who the project's head scientist was reported to be, a Nobel laureate physicist named Walter Gerlach. As Joseph Farrell reports, 2 decades before the Bell project was undertaken, in 1924, Gerlach authored a short article in a weekly German scientific magazine where he indicated that he and a small team were researching alchemy and had made some small but important discoveries. To quote the article, Gerlach wrote that, based on the results of their research, it might be possible to induce the disintegration of mercury with relatively simple physical methods and to clearly identify gold as one of the chemical and physical products of the disintegration. Later in the article, he concludes that the general possibility of an alchemy is no longer in need of proof. Gerlach's involvement in the project as its lead scientist suggests that the bell's true purpose was to harness the principles of alchemy in order to begin experimenting with the creation and dissolution of material form. Truly a frightening idea, given that it was the SS who was doing this research. So that's the end of that section. That was called The Occult Meaning of the Swastika. And that explains some of the details about what this very top secret Bell project was all about. And really, this is just a case study for the larger theme that the Kammlerstab was researching, this either paradigm of physics and trying to weaponize it in something that is truly a form of black magic that they were going into. So this is sort of like what was happening underneath the surface of the Second World War. Okay, now we're going to go back and look at and incorporate some of these mysteries that we were talking about earlier of the German-American cartel connection, because this is where I think this idea of a hidden hand comes into play. And so this next section is called the German-American cartel connection revisited. All right, so the next section is called the German-American cartel connection revisited. Let's get into it. One of the main themes we've been exploring over the past several articles is how, during the 1920s and 30s, a deep-rooted network of connections was systematically set up between key American and German industrial corporations and financial institutions. The situation that resulted was that the military-industrial complexes of both nations were secretly bound together, this coming at a time when both nations were outwardly preparing to go to war with each other. The base of operations for this interconnected cartel network was in America, as it was American capital and technology that was used to set up the German cartel system in the first place. This German cartel system was the entity that, in time, would supply the German war machine. This effort was led by firms such as IG Farben and AEG, two firms that would never have existed without the financial and technological support of American corporations during this interwar period. In short, there would have been no German war campaign without these cartels, and these cartels would not have existed at all were it not for American assistance in setting them up in this interwar period. As we previously explored, it seems that the various players within the American deep state who became involved with this plan did so for different reasons. For example, its capitalist wing profited immensely off the relationship, while its military strategists were able to use the controlled buildup of the German Wehrmacht as a means to pursue their balance of power geopolitical strategy, one that sought to bleed out America's major rivals on the European continent through the orchestration of another war. At a deeper and more secretive level, other factors likely also played into the equation, such as the fact that the ties that were established between American and German industry provided an entry point through which American intelligence agents could infiltrate, spy on, and covertly influence developments taking place within the German Wehrmacht. Given that the German military relied on the cartel system the Americans had set up to supply and build out its various projects and campaigns, U.S. intelligence agents implanted into these major military contractors would have had an entry point into accessing what the Nazis, and particularly the SS, were working on in their secret research facilities. It is also possible that agents embedded in these areas would have had the possibility of steering, guiding, or even sabotaging certain key weapons projects the SS were pursuing, ensuring that things did not develop in too advanced a trajectory. When we consider the fact that the SS's secret weapons research group, the Kammlerstab, was deliberately harvested after the war and utilized as a means to introduce a new paradigm of science and technology into the upper echelons of the American national security state, which had up to then remained out of the loop regarding it, these latter two factors become key. The Kammlerstab was responsible for organizing and facilitating the SS's research into various new paradigms of science and weapons development research, ones including instruments of mass destruction like atomic bombs. But its explorations did not stop there. Its most top secret projects also featured strange and mysterious technologies like the Bell, which were oriented around its attempt at exploring and weaponizing ether-based physics. Here's where we come to an important point. Igor Witkowski, the Polish researcher who broke the Bell story, informs us that there were two primary private contractors involved with the design and build-out of the Bell project. One was Siemens, and the other, AEG. also known as German General Electric. AEG's sister corporation in America, General Electric, was of course the centerpiece of the decades-long American-centered project to, as Anthony Sutton tells us, quote, merge the world electrical industry into a giant cartel under Wall Street control. Apparently, according to Nick Cook, each of these firms maintained highly secretive research and development operations in Lower Silesia, this also being the homeland of the Kammlerstab's black weapons R&D empire. The entire country had been turned into a giant skunk works, with the SS basing its secret weapons empire in this region right alongside the secret research projects run by its private military contractors. Clearly, there is a tight web of connection between the two. What this implies is that the German industrial cartels were completely interwoven and intertwined with the SS's own secret research operations. When we factor in the idea that the major German cartels behind these programs, ones like AEG, had deliberately been set up by the Americans during the pre-war years, the plot thickens considerably. For example, in the case of AEG, Anthony Sutton informs us that, back in 1929, General Electric bought a 25% interest stake in AEG, and soon after, a closer working agreement was signed between the two companies, providing the German company U.S. technology and patents. Further, Sutton informs us that in this agreement, AEG would not have participation in GE, but that on the other hand, GE would finance expansion of AEG in Germany. Therefore, the terms of the agreement seem to have been one-sided, with the U.S. firm penetrating operations within the German company, but not vice versa. Thus, we find no AEG representation on the board of GE in the United States, but there were 5 Americans positioned on the board of AEG in Germany. And one of these just happened to be Gerard Swope, the man behind FDR's New Deal policy. Clearly, the man was a deep state asset. The others likely were as well. So you see, there's these very close connections between AEG and the American deep state. And so AEG was one of the 2 primary contractors on the Bell project. So there's clearly a mechanism of linkage between the Bell project and this whatever entity was behind setting up this cartel system, which would have been based out of America, since America was responsible for setting up the German cartel system in the first place. And as we'll see a little bit below, the SS itself has links to these American capitalists. And my feeling is that these American capitalists who were involved in this, these aren't just greedy oligarchs. These are clearly assets of a deeper national security apparatus. So, all these connections are just, for me, they give away the actual story here. But many people overlook them and they just think of it, it's just collusion, or, in the case of Dr. Farrell, he actually comes to the conclusion that it was the Nazis who were orchestrating everything and sort of like running game on the Americans. And I think it actually is the exact opposite. But it wasn't the overt American state that was running game on Germany. It was this deeper hidden entity that had a long-term agenda that it was setting up decades in advance of the start of this war, because this whole system, this whole cartel system, and the Bank of International Settlements, which supports this sort of state within a state privatized structure, that is all set up in the 1920s. And the payoff for that is coming now in the war, because these key German cartels that were set up by the Americans are the ones who are become deeply involved in this top secret weapons program that was happening within the Nazi state and being run by the SS. And then, as I said before, the SS has its own linkages into these sort of like secret networks of American intelligence. So the game being played here is very complex, but you can just see these links. And there's no way to make sense of all of this without, I think, taking consideration of this theory that I'm laying out. So let's continue. So to give another example of the triangulation between the SS, German industry, and U.S. intelligence, let's consider the case of IG Farben and its possible involvement in the Kammlerstab's secret nuclear weapons program. It is not clear that IG Farben had direct involvement in the Kammlerstab's Bell project, but it does appear that they helped spearhead the SS's secret uranium enrichment program, the one used to develop the Nazis' successful atom bomb project. Apparently, the SS concealed its atomic bomb program under numerous layers of secrecy and misdirection. One of these layers of misdirection concerns the unsuccessful enrichment program of Heisenberg, the famous quantum physicist, who famously failed in his efforts to produce material suitable for the production of a bomb. Most historians have taken the bait and concluded that because his project failed, the Germans therefore never successfully completed a bomb. However, the SS had apparently launched other secret initiatives aimed at enriching nuclear material for the production of a bomb, and one or more of these other programs had proved successful, and to a degree well beyond what the Manhattan Project was able to achieve. As previously discussed, numerous researchers have come to the conclusion that it is more than likely that the Americans obtained a working bomb only after secretly negotiating a trade for German-enriched nuclear materials from SS leaders attempting to escape the collapsing Reich with their lives. In his research, Joseph Farrell has uncovered the idea that at least one of the SS's primary enrichment sites for the production of weapons-grade nuclear materials was concealed within a giant synthetic rubber production plant located next to Auschwitz, the infamous concentration camp. As it turns out, Hans Kammler was the lead engineer who designed the Auschwitz camp. Furthermore, as the head of the SS's Buildings and Works Department, he was also positioned to be directly involved in the design of a secret uranium enrichment facility, should it be concealed within the large Buna rubber factory located next door. And who was the lead contractor in charge of this plant? I.G. Farben. Remember, I.G. Farben was not only the largest military contractor in Nazi Germany, it was also a deliberate creation of the American deep state, it having been initially formed in the 1920s with Wall Street assistance through the merger of 6 already giant German chemical companies. And Hjalmar Schacht was intimately involved in this project, and to me he seems like somebody who is definitely an agent of a deeper hidden entity, because he is extremely involved with all kinds of elite circles in America, and he was the one who supposedly was responsible for giving birth to the idea of the Bank of International Settlements, but really there's no way that he just came up with the idea, because that institution is so central to everything that would happen, and is still happening today. So the idea that he just came up with it on his own is kind of, to me, kind of ludicrous. It seems to me that he was like the agent responsible for bringing this idea formally out and seeding it into the world, but he didn't come up with it. I just can't imagine that he did. Sutton informs us that, quote, between 1927 and the beginning of World War II, I.G. Farben doubled in size, an expansion made possible in great part by American technical assistance and by American bond issues. The ties go deeper. Sutton writes that Farben's board of directors in the late 1920s included Hamburg banker Max Warburg, whose brother Paul Warburg was a founder of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. Not coincidentally, Paul Warburg was also on the board of American IG, which was IG Farben's wholly owned U.S. subsidiary. In addition, the board of American IG had 3 directors from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most influential of the various Federal Reserve banks. And when investigating the extensive corporate connections tied to American IG, one finds familiar names prominently featured, including the Rockefeller-owned enterprises Standard Oil New Jersey and Chase Bank of Manhattan, as well as Ford Motor Company and, you guessed it, AEG, or German General Electric. In his research, Sutton has also uncovered deep ties between prominent American bankers and industrialists and Himmler's SS organization. More and more, these capitalists look more like U.S. intelligence agents than simply greedy oligarchs. Likely they were both. This implies that more than just corruption was taking place, but more significantly, a systematic infiltration of U.S. intelligence assets into Nazi Germany's military-industrial complex. Exploring deeper into the connections between American capitalists and Himmler's SS, Sutton writes how one of the key elements in the Himmler's SS hierarchy was a group known initially as the Kepler Circle and later known as Himmler's Circle of Friends. The primary function of this group seems to have been to provide slush fund financing to Himmler so as to facilitate his pursuit of off-the-books passion projects and research programs. As Sutton further explains, the Kepler Circle originated as a group of German businessmen supporting Hitler's rise to power before and during 1933. In the mid-1930s, the Kepler Circle came under the influence and protection of SS chief Heinrich Himmler and the organizational control of Cologne banker and prominent Nazi businessman Kurt von Schroeder. It is within this innermost of the inner circles, the very core of Nazism, that we find Wall Street, including Standard Oil of New Jersey and ITT, represented from 1933 to as late as 1944. In Himmler's circle of friends, we also find US-affiliated industrial giant IG Farben heavily represented, as no fewer than 8 out of the peak circle membership of 40 were directors of IG Farben or a Farben subsidiary. American-affiliated AEG was also prominently involved. AEG's influence in this circle doesn't stop there. According to Sutton, German General Electric profited greatly from its association with Himmler and other leading Nazis. In fact, several members of the Schroeder clique were directors of AEG. So zooming out, let's investigate once again. What does all this imply? What does it mean? To answer these questions, we come back to the idea that the major industrial cartels behind the German military-industrial complex, and likely the SS itself, were, from the very outset of the war, infiltrated with US intelligence agents. These well-placed assets were strategically positioned within every level of Nazi Germany, their purpose being not only to feed intel back to the Americans, but also to quietly guide and direct the progression of both the Nazi war effort and, more importantly, the development of its secret weapons research projects. All along, the plan was to bring these R&D weapons programs up to a point where they could then be harvested back into the US national security state. This would catalyze a transformation within the culture of America's national security state itself. In my view, this was the ultimate goal, to transform America by means of the Nazis who laid the groundwork. In this way, it would seem that the technological ideas the SS had been working on were originally pioneered by them. This is what the US military elite would perceive. But in reality, all along, in America, secret societies had long been working with these ideas, and to a much more advanced degree. But this fact could remain secret and unknown so long as the US upper brass perceived the SS and the Kammlerstab as being the ones who were the true pioneers. This quote-unquote managed perception would hide the existence of a more advanced program at home, while introducing the either paradigm to America in a form that was still elementary in its progression. Therefore, in harvesting the SS program, the American military would begin its own program picking up where the SS left off. This means it would begin its own domestic project starting from the elementary basis the SS had achieved. The situation was ideal for the Hidden Hand because it was now well positioned to guide the trajectory of scientific discovery taking place now within America, making sure its development didn't proceed too quickly or dangerously. When we put together all this untold information about the story of World War II, we find all the elements necessary to diagnose what really happened in Nazi Germany. It was, from the outset, a controlled operation, one in every way managed and orchestrated by a mysterious hidden hand operating behind and within the US national security state. This secret society must have originated sometime during the 19th century, if not before, and had, by the time of the war, long since developed an advanced level of mastery over the science and technological potentials of the either paradigm of physics that the SS was experimenting with. It was this hidden hand who, over the course of decades, orchestrated the collusion between American and German industrial interests. Through them, it could keep a watchful eye over the SS's secret research programs. All along, it planned for them to make a certain level of progress before eventually halting their work and harvesting their program back into the United States. In this manner, 2 different American research projects would be pursued, a more advanced one by the Hidden Hand and a less advanced one by the upper echelons of the national security state, who imported the SS program into their ranks and would pick up where they had left off. The entire purpose of the project seems to have been to allow Nazi Germany to act as the midwife for birthing the either paradigm into the awareness of the US national security state, the leadership of which, until then, had not been read into what was going on right under their noses in terms of the secret research activities of this hidden hand. By keeping the Germans locked at a certain level of discovery, which they did through assets placed in both the US and German military-industrial complexes, the Hidden Hand could carefully manage the progress each was making in their most top-secret research projects. In this way, they could ensure things never got out of hand on the German side, while also ensuring that the Americans did not discover the either paradigm on their own before the appropriate time. On the German front, the Hidden Hand could work to ensure that the SS wouldn't use its most advanced technologies during the war, while also working to control the level of advancement its R&D programs reached before war's end, at which time they were to be harvested by the American military. Here, the plan was for the US military to quote-unquote stumble upon the Kammlerstab's underground research layers, at which point they would formally discover for themselves what it was the SS had been working on. This would lead them to finally quote-unquote discover the ether paradigm, which would then lead to them finally creating their own American program back home. Of course, only a select few involved would have had the faintest idea that a hidden hand had facilitated the whole thing, beginning decades in advance. At every level and on every side of the project, worldview perceptions had been managed. Initially, before the war, the worldview perception of the US military and their oligarchical backers had been managed in order to disguise the breakthroughs that figures like Nikola Tesla and societies like the Sonora Aero Club had developed right in their backyard. Then, both before and during the war, the worldview perceptions of the Germans had been managed so as to inspire their research into these unorthodox weapons technologies, allowing them to break ground in this new paradigm and develop its concepts up to a certain point, but no further. Finally, after the war, the US military hierarchy would once again have its worldview perception managed. The first step was to allow them to discover for themselves what the SS had done. They then would be inspired to adopt for themselves their own Kammlerstab. In forming their own domestic Kammlerstab program, the Americans would also be inspired to imitate his infrastructure of concealment, including off-the-books financing, need-to-know black projects, underground bases, multiple levels of security control and psyop disinformation campaigns, and the rest. The whole thing had initially been prototyped in Germany. All they had to do was port over to the West a ready-made model of secret scientific research. All along, this was the plan. In sum, by first managing the SS from behind the scenes, the hidden hand could in turn manage what it was the American military leadership would eventually discover after the war's end. Then, having agents infiltrated into the US military-industrial complex itself, this hidden hand could subsequently manage how the US military responded to the input of this new information. This, I believe, is the only explanation that can make sense of all the mysterious elements that played out during the Second World War. Without this theory, we're left scratching our heads, wondering what the hell it was that actually happened during the war. Okay, that's the end of that section. So there, even though I have more sections to go, basically I tried there to really implement the whole big picture and what I think the grand plan was. And so now I'm going to go further into the last two sections of this article, go further into some evidence of how I think this all played out. And so now we're going to go into further details about the system I just talked about. So let's move on to the next section. So this one's very interesting, and this is a story, a little known story that I really only put together kind of accidentally while doing some due diligence on this article. I was inspired to read through Nick Cook's book, which I had read excerpts from, and I had seen it cited in other books, but I hadn't fully read the whole thing. And he has this whole section on this guy named Victor Schauberger. And it turns out that Victor Schauberger's story, I think, provides a lot of supportive evidence for the theory I'm laying out here. And actually I had one of the listeners, I can't remember his name right now, but you'll know who you are, asked me in a comment on my YouTube if I had heard of Victor Schauberger, and I had heard of him, but I just hadn't done a deep dive into it. And I didn't intend to, because I thought I had enough material to present the theory anyway. But as I was going through this Nick Cook book, I found this whole section on Victor Schauberger, and I was like, I have to incorporate this. So this next section is called Victor Schauberger Builds a Flying Saucer. And this is going to be a case study about another secret weapons project being taken on by the SS and the Kammlerstab during the Second World War. It also goes into this ether paradigm of physics, but it seems to have been compartmentalized into a separate branch of the Kammlerstab, separate from the Bell project. And so we're going to be getting into that next. All right, Victor Schauberger builds a flying saucer. The case of Victor Schauberger, a genius inventor and intuitively inspired savant in the mold of Nikola Tesla, offers further evidential support to various aspects of the theory we've been developing so far in this chapter. In particular, Schauberger's story confirms the idea that the SS was pursuing all manner of secret, unorthodox R&D projects. The Bell is perhaps the most prominent example of such a project, but as we will be shortly exploring, Schauberger's experiments in anti-gravity research represents another. As we go into Schauberger's story, we'll also discover supportive evidence for the theory that a hidden hand was present within the SS and interfering with his projects. Indeed, Schauberger perceived his research as having been deliberately interfered with the intention of this interference being to deliberately slow down the pace of his project's development. In addition, Schauberger's story reveals another aspect to World War II I haven't emphasized too much so far, but which is perhaps the strongest factor driving the course of events during this whole period in human history. This is that there seems to have been a powerful element of fate and synchronicity at work in how events played out during this critical time period. Recalling back to previous discussions we've had in earlier articles on the secret destiny of America, I believe that from the beginning it was quote-unquote written in the stars that World War II would play out the way it did. There are larger philosophical implications for this view that we'll get into another time, but for now I want to state my belief that at its innermost core, the hidden hand I've been continuously referencing features among its ranks master astrologers who could read the words written on the walls of heaven and consequently knew in advance the secret destiny of events that were to take place during this period. This was the key to their ability to mastermind the whole situation. They were working in cooperation with the mysterious forces of fate and knew all along that America would be the nation that would rise victorious from the war. Furthermore, they understood that, in the long term, America's destiny is to bring about the new Atlantis. Therefore, they knew that they had fate on their side and that this is the secret ingredient that allowed them to orchestrate their ingenious grand strategy, one they continue to pursue to this day. Let's move now to investigate the details of Schauberger's story, which comes down to us from Nick Cook, who had a chance to get to know Schauberger's later descendants and peruse his journals and notes firsthand. His account of what he discovered in these records is revealed in his book, The Hunt for Zero Point, initially published in 2003. Like Tesla before him, Schauberger was largely a self-taught genius whose inspiration and insight came to him out of his own intuition. In Schauberger's case, his key realizations concern the role that spirals and vortices play in directing how energy flows within natural systems. In particular, he believed that nature utilized the spiraling design of the vortex as the most ideal and efficient means for transmitting energy into form. Schauberger's motto was, quote-unquote, to comprehend and copy nature. Consequently, his central breakthroughs came from his observation of natural phenomena, something he had ample opportunity to do during his early career as a forester. In particular, Schauberger focused on the presence of what he called energy spirals, these being creative whirlpools of nature visible everywhere, from the spiral galaxies of the outer cosmos to the power of a tornado or the double helix of a DNA strand. That was from a quote from Nick Cook. Independently, Schauberger came to similar conclusions as Tesla. That, as one scholar of Schauberger's work, Callum Coates, put it, quote, through the interaction between centrifugal and centripetal forces overlaid on a common axis, one is able to return or retransmute physical form into its primary energetic matrix. This residing within a non-spatial fourth-dimensional state, one that interfaces with but exists outside of the three dimensions of physical existence. By manipulating the ether through vorticular rotation and other means, one is able to produce not only flying anti-gravity machines, but also over-unity energy generation devices. All this is made possible because, by manipulating the ether through specialized spinning vorticular motions, one begins transforming the background context within which material reality is generated and supported. This interpretation allows us to make sense of one of Schauberger's key quotes, which Cook cites him as having written in his diary in August 1936. Here he stated, quote, I stand face to face with the apparent void, the compression of dematerialization that we are wont to call a vacuum. He then makes a statement reminiscent of what Tesla had declared decades prior. Quote, I can now see that we are able to create anything we wish for ourselves out of this nothing. And he put nothing in quotes, so really he's talking about the ether. Like Tesla, Schauberger was at heart a peaceful idealist. He wanted to use his ideas to create a harmonious society, one that would integrate naturally with nature's innate energetic processes. He only came to work for the SS through coercion, with the safety of his family threatened should he refuse. The story begins in 1939. According to Cook, this is when Schauberger, quote, conceived of a device that could be put to use either as an energy generator or as a power plant for aircraft or submarines. Shortly afterward, he wrote to his cousin that he had invented an aircraft that didn't make any noise. With these devices, Schauberger realized he had created an entirely new methodology for propelling vehicles through air and water. At this time, the self-trained Schauberger was working on his own in his native Austria. But he began to attract attention to himself once he filed for a patent on the engineering designs for his invention. During this period, he had also hired a contractor to help him build out a prototype for his device. According to diagrams and notes that Schauberger preserved, the machine required a small starter motor to commence the device's internal processes. But, once having, quote, whipped the turbine up to around 15,000 to 20,000 RPM, the motor was turned off and the operation became self-sustaining. According to rare family records that Nick Cook was able to gain access to, this prototype was described as having a twofold purpose: to investigate free energy production and to validate his theories of levitational flight. 1941 was the key year in which everything changed for the pioneering genius. By February of that year, Schauberger had hired a contractor and was working on a prototype for his device. Apparently, it showed promising signs of working. Cook writes how, relatively early on in the development of the prototype, an associate of Schauberger's made an unauthorized test run of the device while Schauberger was absent from the plant. During this experiment, the machine generated such a powerful levitational force that it shot upward, smashing against the roof of the hangar. The device was damaged enough that it needed repair, but this process was delayed because, in March, the Gestapo, the infamous secret police controlled by the SS, had become aware of his work. Around the same time, a German military contractor called Heinkel, specializing in jet technology, became aware of Schauberger's patents. As Cook explains it, Heinkel had illegally obtained sight of Schauberger's patent application at the Reich Patent Office, and without the Austrian inventor's knowledge, had begun to incorporate his ideas into a Heinkel project. In May, the SS formally approached him, notifying him of the infringement and promising him that if he came to work for them, they would not restrict his work. Far from it. But there was a catch. In the future, he had to pursue it in secret. Schauberger accepted, perhaps because he had no other choice. Thereafter, he embarked on what Nick Cook describes as a period of highly covert activity in Schauberger's life, about which he leaves few clues in his letters. One thing is certain: almost immediately after making his deal with the SS, he was jettisoned away to the heart of Kammler's secret empire in Bohemian Czechoslovakia. Surveying the scattering of notes, journal entries, and letters that the Schauberger family had preserved from this period, Cook concludes that, quote, what appears to be the case is that Schauberger's work was central to a number of parallel activities during 1941 and 1942. These include Heinkel's mysterious work at Marienhe, a top-secret weapons factory in Czechoslovakia, along with his initial project with the Kurtel Company in Vienna, the contractor he had originally hired, and a Messerschmitt project in Augsburg. Furthermore, Schauberger's notes indicate that his anti-gravity machine was not the only technology program he was recruited into working on during this period. In his diaries, he reveals other projects he had also been involved in. One was a water purifier, another was an energy device capable of generating high-voltage electricity, a third was for biosynthesizing hydrogen fuel from water, a fourth was a machine that naturally produced intense heat or cold, and finally, the fifth project was his Fliegende Scheibe, or flying saucer apparatus. His original prototype for the flying saucer, the one that had become damaged during its test flight, was contracted to the Kurtel Company in Austria. This was one of the projects Schauberger continued to work on after being shanghaied by the SS. He commented in a letter to his son that the work being done to repair it was going so slowly, it is as if someone was deliberately trying to slow it down. This is a statement pregnant with implications. Who could it have been, and what were their motivations for doing so? Given the potential value of the project to the SS's short-term goal of winning the war, one would assume it would have been given utmost attention and priority. But apparently, this wasn't the case. Someone was interfering. Ultimately, the repair project had to be scrapped. As Cook informs us, work ceased due to the company's inability to obtain essential supplies for the repair of the damaged device. This is not unreasonable given Germany's growing inability to get a hold of strategic raw materials from this period on. But Schauberger still voices his doubts, being convinced that somebody has ordered the work to be slowed deliberately. Schauberger also noted that the Messerschmitt project he was working on suffered a catastrophic failure due to the use of substandard casting techniques and probably low-grade metal alloys during the manufacture of the turbine. According to Schauberger, it suffered a meltdown as soon as it reached its maximum rotational velocity. As to the above-mentioned Heinkel project, here we find a potential culprit for who was sabotaging the repair on Schauberger's initial saucer prototype. Either this or strategically placed U.S. intelligence assets were running interference on the plan. On the possibility of Heinkel acting as the potential saboteur, remember they had already stolen elements of his blueprint for the device from the patent office, Cook uncovered an interesting anecdote referenced in one of Schauberger's journals, writing, quote, "After the war, when Schauberger picked up on rumors of German flying saucers that supposedly flew near Prague during the closing stages of the conflict, he voiced his conviction that these were developments of his own ideas. And given the way Heinkel had behaved, this may have been the case, should these actual flying saucer rumors have been true. Who knows?" By 1944, Schauberger's efforts at developing a functional saucer prototype appeared to have achieved success, at least enough to where the SS was now interested in preparing things to move into mass manufacture. Summarizing the multi-year life cycle of Schauberger's involvement with the Kammlerstab, Cook concludes that 1941 represents the start date for prototype work of a diverse and highly secret nature, work that continued up until early 1944 when the SS became satisfied that the machines were ready for manufacture. In August of that year, the first set of pre-production drawings were signed off on and delivered from the engineer school to the production facilities. Let's pause and consider the gravity of what we're uncovering here. As Nick Cook puts it, quote, "Via Schauberger, the Nazis had been deeply involved, no question, in what can only be described as flying saucer technology." Nick Cook's research into Schauberger's wartime diaries makes it clear that he had built a machine that had flown earlier in the war at Kurtl. And during his secret period in Czechoslovakia, he had almost certainly built another. This is confirmed by the Schauberger archive. The SS wanted him to stop, as he quotes himself, tinkering around with prototypes and begin serious construction work. But here's where the hands of fate and the workings of synchronicity step in and play their part. Almost as soon as the plans were approved to begin production on Schauberger's flying saucer model, all kinds of obstacles moved in and prevented work from being completed. A major factor was the fact that, around this period, the surrounding Allied war campaign against the Nazis began making deep penetrations into Nazi-held territory. These intruded on the production effort, causing supply shortages, power stoppages, bombing raids, and more. These came together to interfere with the goal of producing a viable mass-manufactured product from Schauberger's designs and prototypes. Because of the constant threats and challenges that now faced the struggling Nazi Wehrmacht, Schauberger's attention kept being redirected toward other projects to plug necessary holes. This served to further delay the development of his prototype. Finally, as Cook tells us, quote, "On April 5th, 1945, the diary reveals that final assembly of the repulsine, which was the name he gave to his device, had commenced. A month later, it was ready for go. But the end, when it came, was almost surreal. Instead of firing up the turbine for its first test run as planned on May 6th, Schauberger awoke to find that the SS officers charged with oversight of the operation had fled into the night. The team stopped work on May 8th, hours before the surrender of German forces took effect a minute past midnight on May 9th. Talk about a synchronicity. The very day that the test run was to begin, the war ended. The project never got off the ground. What happened next lends credence to my theory that a deeper game was being played out behind the scenes during the war. Cook tells us that mere days after the end of the war, U.S. intelligence agents found Schauberger in Lienstein, which was a small town in Austria, and apprehended him. Faithfully, or perhaps intentionally, he had been relocated to this small village in North Austria in the last months of the war, taking him away from Vienna, his previous base of operations. This is significant, because Vienna was located in what would become Soviet-occupied territory, while Lienstein fell in the U.S. zone. The question is, how had the U.S. intelligence agents found him? Schauberger notes in his diary that they were, as Cook words it, remarkably well informed about his entire operation. It was as if, as Schauberger later noted, someone had guided them directly to him. As we will see in the next and final section of this article, this is not the only case where U.S. intelligence agents swooped in to confiscate and cover up the secret wartime R&D projects of the Kammlerstab. It also happened with the Bell. One possibility seems certain. Someone very high up within the Kammlerstab, including possible Kammler himself, had made a deal with U.S. intelligence officials to trade information on these secret weapons research projects in exchange for their lives. But another seems equally plausible, and may also be true, that U.S. intelligence assets had infiltrated the Kammlerstab, likely from the start, and thus already knew where the most valuable assets they would need to harvest after the war were held. Cook informs us that once under the control of U.S. intelligence, for the next 9 months, until March 1946, Schauberger was held under close house arrest and extensively debriefed by U.S. technical intelligence about his activities during the war. By the early part of 1946, following the debriefings and their admonition to Schauberger never again to involve himself in science of this nature, the Counterintelligence Corps, an early version of the CIA, would have had in its possession the rudiments of an entirely new propulsion medium. So they would have had basically the designs and plans to make a flying saucer. Cook wonders if this is what led to General Nathan Twining of the USAAF Air Material Command to admit in a classified memo a mere 18 months later that it was now possible within the present U.S. knowledge, provided extensive detailed development is undertaken, to construct a piloted aircraft with the operating characteristics of a UFO, a craft that seemingly defied the laws of physics. And that comes from Twining himself. Clearly, the strange and mysterious case of Victor Schauberger tells us something important about the secret history of World War II. As Cook concludes, quote, something about this whole strand of development had conspired to make Schauberger's work the most classified form of technology in existence, even more so than the atomic bomb. Unlike the bomb, however, this was a secret that had held for more than 50 years. It is difficult to get a measure of just exactly what Schauberger did accomplish, since all of his wartime German patents have simply disappeared. No one knows where. But it seems certain, however, that Schauberger's discs approach the form and function of what we call today flying saucers. Schauberger's own post-war reconstructions of what these craft looked like demonstrates this fact beyond the shadow of a doubt. It is all but certain Victor Schauberger, a pioneering genius in the mold of Tesla, had developed the prototype for a working flying saucer. This fact alone should destroy forever the notion that the workings of UFOs are entirely unexplainable and can therefore only be the product of aliens. At the moment I'm writing this narrative is starting to be pushed in various media outlets by certain whistleblowers. And so my advice is don't believe it. And as this case of Schauberger testifies, and this whole situation with the Kammlerstab, reveals, it's definitely in the orbit of entirely human science and human technology to create these kind of crafts. So yeah, don't believe it. Don't believe the hype. Okay, that's the end of that section. Once again, that was called Victor Schauberger Builds a Flying Saucer. And now finally, we're going to move into the last section of this article, and that's called America Harvests the Kammlerstab. All right, last section, America Harvests the Kammlerstab. As I mentioned previously, the case of Victor Schauberger is not the only instance where we find American intelligence assets swooping in after the war to gather up and harvest knowledge and hardware pertaining to the Kammlerstab's secret weapons R&D projects. In his book, The Hunt for Zero Point, Nick Cook uncovered what was, at the time, a little-known work of journalism called Blunder, written by British foreign correspondent Tom Agustin. Agustin was in Germany in 1949 reporting on the Nuremberg prosecutions. It was here that he came across a man named Wilhelm Voss, who confided to Augustin his account of what he had experienced during the war. As it turns out, Voss was an associate of Kammler's and worked high up within the inner ranks of the Kammlerstab. The account he gave to Augustin is one of the only publicly available first-hand sources we have about Kammler or the inner workings of his highly secret think tank. In fact, not long after he talked to Augustin, Voss was captured by U.S. intelligence agents, debriefed, and warned against ever speaking about what he knew or experienced. He then contacted Agustin and told him he couldn't write about what he had confided to him. For this reason, Agustin had to wait several decades for Voss to pass away before finally publishing his account. In their conversations together, Voss described the activities of the scientists at the Kammlerstab as beyond any technology that had appeared by the end of the war, working on weapon systems that made the V-1 and V-2 rockets look pedestrian. Voss had told Augustin how, in the week or so period between the surrender of the German army and the arrival of the Soviets into the Nazi-held Czech territories that they would come to occupy after the war, American intelligence agencies had swept into the most important secret facilities of the Kammlerstab and vacuumed up everything of importance, not just blueprints and scientific papers, but experimental technological devices as well. This includes the Bell, which was packed up and shipped out before the Russians arrived on the scene. Again, just as we found with the case of Victor Schauberger, it is clear that they knew exactly where to look and what to look for. Consider this account from Augustin's book as summarized by Cook. Quote, when Voss was picked up by agents of the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps soon after hostilities ended, He told them about the existence of the Kammlerstab at Skoda. Their reaction surprised him. They appeared so unmoved by the notion that the Special Projects Group had contained a Pandora's box of exotic military secrets that he concluded that U.S. intelligence agents already knew. And when Voss went on to propose that they should spare no effort in finding Kammler before the Russians got to him, the CIC agents appeared equally uninterested. The most obvious explanation is that Kammler had already defected and laid out the map to where all the treasures were hidden. He disappeared after the war, and there is evidence that he was captured by the Americans. For example, in this recent documentary, one man testifies that, and I have a link there, so in a recent documentary, one man testifies that his father told him on his deathbed that he had been involved with a post-war interrogation of Kammler by the OSS, an early forerunner of the CIA. But it is also possible that U.S. intelligence had long since infiltrated the Kammlerstab and already knew what the lay of the land was, independent of Kammler's confession. I mean, it could even be that Kammler himself was an agent. I mean, his rise to power, I mean, his rise within the ranks of the SS was so meteoric that it's almost like, okay, wait, how did this happen? And he was in charge of so many different things. It's almost unbelievable that one person could be such a mastermind over not only the build out of all the facilities, all the underground facilities, and like how they were all connected together, but he was also became at the end in charge of the weapons programs themselves. I mean, it just seems like so much for one person to have been in charge of just all by himself in such a short period of time. So, but that's just, a speculation. Evidence of advanced U.S. intelligence regarding the Kammlerstab is also indicated in the story of how the U.S. military's 3rd Army Platoon, led by General Patton, was, during the final stages of the war, tipped off to the Kammlerstab's existence. Consequently, they immediately dropped their plans to march on Berlin and instead made a mass dash toward Bohemian Czechoslovakia to loot Kammler's secret facilities of anything important before the Soviets arrived. Joseph Farrell informs us of the story, writing how World War II ended in Europe with the armored divisions of U.S. General George S. Patton's 3rd Army lunging deep into the tottering Third Reich toward these regions in Czechoslovakia that the Kammlerstab was centered around, particularly those in Pilsen. These were the nerve centers of Kammler's Black Projects empire that they moved right into. And this they did at a pace that Farrell describes as literally racing, moving as fast as operationally possible. And making this mad dash for Czechoslovakia, this unit made a sudden turn from its victorious drive on Berlin, which is what the original plan of the unit was supposed to be. So sudden was the shift in strategy that it caught Nazi, Soviet, and U.S. field commanders by complete surprise. The cover story for the campaign was that the U.S. had received new intelligence of a Nazi redoubt in the Czech region, one that featured the possibility of prolonged guerrilla warfare with SS holdouts in the area. In reality, it is clear that no redoubt existed and that it was actually the Kammlerstab's secret underground lair that was their target. Their task was to vacuum up anything of value left in it. This explains why Patton drove his troops with unerring accuracy right toward its super-secret installations, many of them underground and carefully camouflaged. Farrell wonders if, in the mission's official cover story of heading off a possible Nazi redoubt, there was an element of worldview perception management at play. He writes that, quote, given the sensitivity of the project, it is plausible that the OSS decided not to share this information with the Supreme Allied Command and proffered the redoubt and fleeing Nazi stories as a cover to sell the Allied Command on a shift of objectives away from Berlin. If there was a secret element to this mission, and Schauberger's and Voss's accounts appear to confirm that there was, then one and only one general was in a position to know the real and whole story about the redoubt and what was actually recovered in these regions in Czechoslovakia, and that was General George S. Patton. Farrell elaborates, writing, quote, Patton, as his troops entered the Skoda works at Pilsen and the underground factories and laboratories at the Three Corners region in Thuringia, would have been privy to the top-secret reports of his divisional commanders entering these super-secret Reich facilities. Patton would thus have a thorough first-hand knowledge of the complete inventory of the Reich's most sensitive black programs. Given the situation, that Patton likely knew much of the general outlines of this treasure trove and what it portended for future secret weapons development, it is slightly curious that he would die so soon after the war ended, being killed in December 1945 as the result of a broken neck suffered in a car wreck in which none of the other 3 passengers in the vehicle, all military affiliated, were injured. Or perhaps it was just fate. Either way, one of the only individuals outside of the upper echelons of the US intelligence community who knew of the Kammlerstab's hidden secrets was wiped out almost immediately after the war, taking his knowledge with him to the grave. Furthermore, as Farrell tells us, quote, all the documents of Patton's troops are still sealed and classified to this day. Curious. Zooming out, and now looking at the full picture as a whole, it is clear that the U.S. national security state harvested the Kammlerstab after the war, and not just its technology and science, but also its operational parameters as well. Farrell points out that, quote, having performed a preliminary assessment of the second and third generation weaponry Kammler's scientists had begun to research, the OSS who arrived at these sites must have immediately realized the material would require the tightest security and highest classification then possible, beyond that even of the Manhattan Project. As I've been theorizing, I think this was the whole point. The mysterious hidden hand behind the American power structure, the one who long since developed a mastery over the science and technology capabilities of either energy, needed the U.S. national security state to discover what the Kammlerstab had been working on and replicate their operations at home. This would lead the U.S. elite to conclude that they, too, needed to begin their own highly secretive, highly compartmentalized, entirely off-the-books R&D project, a permanent Manhattan Project, one based around this paradigm of either energy they had newly discovered. This also means that they would need to build their own underground bases, protected by triple layers of security, disinformation campaigns, and the rest, just as the Kammlerstab had. By replicating this structure, the U.S. national security state would create the infrastructure of a system that this hidden hand could embed itself into and guide from within. From this power base, it could then steer the trajectory of American empire, while remaining totally secret and hidden, getting this new Kammlerstab, this new American version, to do its bidding for it. This is what it needed all along. And World War II was what allowed them to get it. That the Kammlerstab was harvested by secret elements within the U.S. military intelligence is unassailable. The testimonies of Schauberger and Voss all but prove it, and the case is further driven home when we consider what happened in the years immediately following the conclusion of the war. For one, untold numbers of SS operatives were brought into this country and implemented into the U.S.'s domestic version of the Kammlerstab through operations like Operation Paperclip. One reason for their importation would have been to tutor U.S. scientists raised on relativity theory into the basics of either energy. But another reason may have been to import their methods for preserving secrecy, compartmentalizing operations, misdirecting through psyops, and other means of running black projects, which the Kammlerstab had perfected during the war. It was time for these now to be brought into and institutionalized within the American national security state, and programs like Operation Paperclip allowed this to happen. To fully understand the scope of this harvesting and the world that was created as a result of it, let's consider once again the parameters of what the Kammlerstab Black Projects Unit entailed. As Farrell explains, quote, unlike even its Manhattan Project counterpart, it had no connection to the standard branches of the German military, the German state, or even the Nazi Party. It was entirely off the books. It is, in every sense that we have now come to know, a black project, one that coordinated all subsequent black projects in Nazi Germany. Its most important projects were tucked away within various overt R&D projects, such as the V-2 rocket program. And even then, the most highly classified of these projects, ones such as the Bell, were masked and concealed behind a portfolio of comparatively less classified projects, such as its atomic weapons program, which itself featured a number of fronts and misdirections, such as Heisenberg's failed uranium enrichment program. To conceal the physical locations of its black projects portfolio, an elaborate and comprehensive network of underground facilities were constructed, often several layers deep, with higher levels masking what was being worked on several layers below them. These massive underground complexes housed entire factories, research facilities, and living quarters for the scientists and laborers working in them. These projects were organized, financed, and implemented through a system of public-private partnerships that functioned entirely outside of the oversight of the overt Nazi state, with heads of key Nazi governmental and military departments not even being aware of their existence. The whole thing was off the books, in other words. Farrell adds to this point, writing that the Kammlerstab had created vast and secret bureaucracies with their own infrastructures independent of the state itself, the purpose of these being to conduct secret research into advanced technologies and to bring those technologies into existence. The Kammlerstab operated in a manner that was permanently independent of the state budget. As Farrell further notes, The aim was to, quote, create a black budget, doubtless in an effort to mask the vast secret weapons research being conducted within Himmler's SS, and in coordination with the slave labor available in the concentration camps. Of course, by the time Hitler gave his formal approval of this, or to this project, the process had already been underway for a number of years. Of course, the whole operation couldn't have functioned without the involvement of Germany's massive and powerful industrial cartels, nor could it have worked without the implicit involvement of the country's central banking system. This part makes me suspicious that the whole operation was infiltrated from the start and may have even been set up by a hidden hand. Finally, the Kammlerstab's operations were concealed and protected under numerous layers of security, counterintelligence, and operational compartmentalization. Psyops of various sorts were also used to mask its existence from outside eyes, including those of the official party leaders of the Nazi government. This is what the American national security state harvested after the war, and this is what they recreated within America itself, beginning in the years immediately following the war. Just consider the massive top-secret underground military installations existing at sites like Groom Lake in Nevada, popularly termed Area 51, and China Lake in California, although there are numerous others. By all accounts, these facilities are the home of various off-the-books black projects, ones that have, for nearly 70 years, continued to carry on the legacy of secret research into breakthrough energy technologies of the sort that the Kammlerstab was originally working to discover all those decades ago. Unsurprisingly, these facilities are run and operated primarily by large defense contractors like Lockheed Martin. The entrance to one of Lockheed's off-the-books underground facilities is featured above. Good luck figuring out what actually goes on under there. But if I had to guess, I would speculate that at least part of it has to do with the development of the types of mysterious anti-gravity machines and UFOs that spectators by the thousands, if not millions, have cited in the decades since the end of the Second World War. Consider also the passage of the National Security Acts of 1947 and 1949. As financial analyst Catherine Austin Fitz explains, what the 1947 and 1949 Acts did in combination was it allowed appropriations to draw money out of other agency budgets for the intelligence agencies on a non-transparent basis. So with these acts, you created an infrastructure that allowed money to be secretly channeled to secret projects on a non-transparent basis, so there's no accountability. This situation was further reinforced by a top-secret post-World War II operation that took place in the South Pacific, where vast quantities of stolen wealth accumulated by Japan during the war was seized by American intelligence. According to research conducted by Sterling and Peggy Seagrave and shared in their book Gold Warriors, the decision was made by President Truman to keep these funds secret and off the books, thereby providing the U.S. deep state with virtually limitless, unaccountable funds that could be used to finance off-the-books black projects for decades to come. Finally, consider the consequences of America's immediate pivot into the Cold War, the topic of our next article. This led to the rise of a never-ending war economy, one that facilitated not only the rise of the endless growth of America's military-industrial complex, but also the rise within it of shadowy intelligence agencies like the CIA and NSA. All of this existing, again, without oversight. The Cold War was an invaluable resource for the American national security state, giving it all the cover and legitimacy it needed to set up the exact type of system that the Nazi SS had originally pioneered with the Kammlerstab, including the establishment of a permanent system of secrecy, compartmentalization, and off-the-books weapons development projects. In short, the Cold War served as the perfect excuse through which to establish the type of autonomous state-within-a-state infrastructure that the SS once pioneered within Germany. It also legitimated the rapid expanse of American empire over the face of the world, with the domino theory of communist expansion serving as the perfect excuse to demand the nations of the West to come into America's orbit of influence. This also helped to facilitate the continued expansion of America's secret World Energy Cartel project, the beginnings of which trace back to the early decades of the 20th century. Before concluding, let's revisit the thesis I presented earlier, that a hidden hand facilitated this whole operation into place. The contours of the post-war structure that was set up is exactly what the hidden hand needed for its long-range vision to come into fruition. An American empire, global in scope, hiding within its core a secret technology program, one the hidden hand could manage from within, ensuring that its progress proceeded along a pre-planned trajectory. The Kammlerstab gave the Americans, quote-unquote, gave them, the idea and template for the establishment of the system. I would say it was more like it was given to them. But anyway, so this is the hidden agenda behind World War II. it led to the American national security state adopting, of its own volition, the type of secret, compartmentalized, state-within-a-state structure that the Kammlerstab originally pioneered and which the hidden hand needed in order to facilitate its grand plan. The grand plan is ultimately to create a world order safe for the types of technology it conceals to come out and finally be used on a global basis. This, of course, would change the entire world order. It would not only bring the world into a state of world government, a global nation, but the scientific paradigm which would be revealed alongside these technologies would, on a more profound level, transform everything we know about science, reality, and the connection that the material world has to the larger cosmos that embeds it. This is the promise of a new golden age, a new Atlantis. But it has to be prepared for and built towards. The institutional, psychological, and material infrastructure required to support it has to be maneuvered into place. And this has to be done in secret. No one save those initiated into the secret society at the apex of this system can know the full extent of the plan. This situation necessitates a condition of absolute secrecy, and this secrecy creates the condition for the shadow to emerge. The social order we live in is a product of this mix of secrecy and shadow. The feedback loops have broken down, and ignorance reigns. This is the inevitable consequence of secrecy. Where light doesn't shine through, the shadow flourishes. Could it have gone differently? I don't think so. I think what we're encountering here is the Dharma, the inevitable result of unresolved Atlantean karma mixing with the trial by fire, pressure cooker energy that comes with man's descent into the Kali Yuga. Just keep in mind this. Life is eternal. No one really dies, but instead moves into and out of physical existence according to the needs of their own soul. Also, nothing can happen to you that is not already written into your horoscope, given to each of us at our time of birth. We're all evolving through time, and the Dharma is the pattern of law that ensures that each of us will one day fulfill our destinies. We suffer in order to learn, and the intense period of suffering mankind went through during this period and continues to go through today all sets the stage for a great transformation and breakthrough we will collectively experience, each on our own levels, at the time appropriate to each. To state this is not to try to excuse anything that happened, but rather to attempt to understand why, at the deepest level, all this happened and for what purpose. We must try to constructively answer the question, how can there be a benevolent God and yet suffering on the scale of what was experienced in World War II be allowed to happen? It is only through philosophy that such questions can be answered, and only by factoring in concepts like the world soul and reincarnation do we gain the resources necessary to come to an adequate explanation. It's like Francis Bacon, via Shakespeare, once said, quote, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages." Okay, that's it. That's the end of the article. Thank you very much to everybody who stayed along the whole ride. And I just want to say thank you to all of y'all who have been tuning in. I just want to let you know this past week passed a threshold that means something to me. It's the 100,000 download mark on the podcast. And so thank you again for following along. And I hope this has been of value to you in your own journey, all this information. So until next time, this is Alex Sakin and the Wisdom Tradition Podcast, and God bless.